Here's a little bit of Old Testament trivia, just to kick things off, okay? What do Michal, Ahinoam, Abigail, Ma'akah, Haggith, Abital, and Eglah all have in common? Okay, and Bathsheba. What do they all have in common? See, I knew that adding Bathsheba was gonna ruin it because at first you were like, I don't know, I've never heard of these people. And then I said Bathsheba and you're like, oh, maybe they were all married to David. And they were, so whatever. They're all David's wives. Congratulations, way to ruin it. Stick around, we'll talk about it. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. We're here to study the Bible. Might get us in trouble, cause we're being intentionally provocative with our intros. Bathsheba is by far and away the most well-known of the Davidic wives, and we will tell her story in another video, if for no other reason than just to clearly and articulately communicate this message. Bathsheba was not seducing David. If there's one person to blame in that whole fiasco, it's David, the king, the one who's not off fighting the wars, the one with all of the power. I don't even know why that needs to be said, but it does, because I keep hearing and have heard a lot this sort of weird take on Bathsheba, which is completely not true at all. So, but before we get to Bathsheba, I want us to go back to the beginning, to David's first wife, according to the biblical narrative, to Michal. Now, brace yourself, because I'm going to be reading against the grain here a little bit. I don't know if you saw that one coming, but this is what's about to happen. Michal, just to set the scene, Michal was one of Saul's daughters. And in the story, her marriage with David provided him with a rightful claim to Saul's throne, which is really weird according to the depiction of Saul and David's relationship in the Bible, but also just historically unlikely that Saul would offer this. Now, think about it for a second. Saul hates David, right? Saul is intimidated by David. Saul is jealous of David. Saul tries to kill David numerous times in many ways. He throws a spear at him at least twice. He sends him to war as the captain of 1,000. Not because David is an accomplished military tacticianer. I mean, he may have been. In the story, he's very successful. But Saul is just simply trying to kill him by sending him to where war was happening. Saul also encouraged his fighting by dangling his oldest daughter, Merab, in front of him, saying, "Here is my eldest daughter, Merab. Her shall I give you as a wife. Only be a valiant fellow for me and fight the battles of the Lord." It's subtle in this translation. This is Robert Alter's translation that I'm reading just for fun. It's subtle, but the narrator takes away all doubt in Saul's inner monologue, which he includes in the next line. It says this: "Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. I don't want to kill David, but if the Philistines do, well, that's okay." Now, the problem for Saul was none of these attempts worked. David was successful in all he did. He kept succeeding, or as DJ Khaled would say, all he did was win, 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 no matter what. All I do is win, 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 no matter what. You weren't expecting that, were you? Maybe you're not expecting this either. I don't know. I'm just trying to keep you guys on your toes, so just, be prepared. When Saul saw that this arrangement was going to cost him giving his oldest daughter to David, because then David would have a really legitimate path to kingship, he goes back on the deal and actually gives his oldest daughter to another guy named Adriel. Now, Saul Saul was a lot of things, but he was not the most original guy, so he tries this tactic again. This time he entices David with another of his daughters named Michal. And the thought was, if David didn't die trying to win her as a wife, then maybe when they became husband and wife that she would make him preoccupied. The text says she would become a snare to him. Now this again was a risky political move for Saul, but his intent was on making sure that David was dead. So he sets a bride price for his daughter Michal, and he sets it at 100 Philistine foreskins. And I'm just as excited as you right now as to what image Tessa will use to help communicate this point. So let's try. Saul sets the bride price for his daughter Michal at 100 Philistine foreskins, thinking maybe the Philistines wouldn't be so terrible at killing him this time and David would maybe die. He's not going to come home with a bag full of 100 foreskins, but as we know, David was a valiant fellow. And he went to war, and he came back with not 100, not 101, not 150, but 200.
All I do is win, no matter what.
I do wonder what you say when you come home from a long day of battling and you've got a sack full of foreskins.
All I do is win, no matter what.
I mean, what do you say? It was a good day for foreskins, or a bad day. Jokes and laughter. I'll let your mind go wild with that, but let's bring it back here. This time, David was successful, and Saul makes good on his end of the bargain. So he gave David Michal, his daughter, as a wife. His political gamble in the story, it does not pay off for him. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but throughout, I keep saying in the story, because again, some commentators note how tenuous all of this is from a historical point of view. Why would Saul offer his daughters to David? Why would he make that gamble? And why would he make good on it when David succeeded? One scholar, Stephen Mackenzie, writes, "This marriage makes David Saul's son-in-law, and that gives him a legitimate, though indirect, claim to the kingdom." This is not to mention any of the offspring that the two might produce and their role in all of this as well. Along the same lines, Baden concludes, it was historically highly unlikely that Saul would actually make such an offer. It would have been too risky, but you know, we've got the text that we need to deal with. Michal, we are told, loves David. There's even this really weird story of her helping David to escape Saul. Again, Saul is super ticked and he wants to kill David, his daughter's husband, and she hides him. Now, this is not germane to what we're talking about, but I just think it's really funny, so I want to tell you about it. Again, Saul, being mad, wants to hunt down David and kill him. Michal basically says, "Get out of here, you gotta go." She lowers him down through the window, and then to hide the fact that he's gone, it says that she takes an idol or idols and lays them on the bed, and then she put a net of goat's hair on its head and covered it with clothes. This is sort of like you sneak out of the window and you put the pillows and you tuck them all around to make them look like you're still there. This is what she's doing. But the weird bit is that word for idol, it's the same word that's used for the household idols that Rachel sits on when she's leaving her uncle's house, Laban. And from this, some people think that if these things were small enough for one person to sit on and another person is putting them in the bed, that maybe David was just super short. Isn't that fun? So just may that bless you and keep you. Anyway, the Bible seems to depict Michal as loving David. And here again is where it gets weird. Just like Jonathan, Michal never leaves her dad's side. In fact, when David flees into the wilderness after that whole, I'm gonna put you in the bed with a net of goat hair and cover you up, after that whole thing, Michal doesn't go with David, which is really, really weird in this time period. Also, get this. Side note, it's also weird in our time period, just to leave your wife behind as you're fleeing in the wilderness. But again, get this. Much later in the story, after Saul dies, the narrator recounts the ongoing struggle between the house of Saul and the house of David. And in 2 Samuel 3, it lists David's family tree. And it says that sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon of Ahinoam of Jezreel. His second, Chileab of Abigail, the widow of Nabal at Carmel. The third, Absalom, son of Maacah, daughter of King Talmai of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, son of Haggith. The fifth, Shephatiah, son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream of David's wife Eglah. Who's missing here? Now, this could be because Michal is barren. This could also be because David has had to leave. This could also be, and this one's a bit more insidious, that David didn't want her to be pregnant because if she had a kid, then that would be Saul's heir. Or it could be, now stick with me here, it could be that they were never married in the first place. Okay, now I know I'm asking a lot of you, but just stick with me here. One of the overarching themes of these videos has been that the author of Samuel is shaping history for his specific purposes. The author is telling a story in a certain way, probably to help legitimize David for kingship. So in the last video, I talked about David marrying Abigail, and at the end of that story, there's this line that's just tacked on that references David's other wife, Ahinoam. It's buried. It's like the author doesn't really want us to engage it, maybe even just to see it. It's just sort of appears there. And I argue that this is probably the case because the only other named Ahinoam in the Bible is Saul's wife. So potentially David has stolen Saul's wife and in so doing has incited a coup, and David is now vying for kingship. With Michal, we have all of this weird stuff with Saul, the questions of why in the world would he offer his daughter, why would he want David to be closer to the throne, why, just normal questions that make us at least pause and say, it's very unlikely that this would happen. It's just too great of a risk. What does Saul have to benefit by making these sort of rash offers? And then there's this weird scenario. Right after we learn about Ahinoam, the author includes another explanatory note. It says this, and Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galim. Again, in review, David and Michal, David flees from Saul, Michal doesn't go with him, Saul gives Michal to some dude named Palti, David has no kids with Michal and says nothing about Michal from that point on in the narrative until Saul is dead, and until the kingship is open. And until the conflict between the house of Saul and the house of David reaches a breaking point. And in this moment of power mixed with opportunity, David convinces Abner, who used to function as Saul's military commander, he convinces him to bring Michal to him. He says, I'll make a covenant with you, Abner, but one thing I require of you. You shall never appear in my presence unless you bring Saul's daughter Michal when you come to see me. Now, this request, historically speaking, it makes a lot of sense. David had control of the south already, and if he could find a way to gain power in the north, he would, in essence, unite the kingdom. Marrying Michal Saul's daughter, the text wants us to be reminded, allows him to do that. If he can have Abner bring Michal to him now in the story and they become husband and wife, then David's path to kingship will be much, much easier. Again, I know what you're thinking. Like, that's just a lot. Why would the Bible make all of this stuff up about Michal and how she loves him and the weird story about the idols, and why would we hear about Saul giving her away to Palti, and just all these different pieces that, yeah, we could reconfigure them to make sense of what you're saying, but why do we have to do that? Here's two possible reasons why this might have been the case. One, without Michal, David has no clear path to the throne. He's just a renegade musician slash shepherd slash warrior from Bethlehem. This relationship provides some, not much, but some legitimization to David's kingship. And two, and I think this is more important, without Saul handing Michal over to David, without that whole bit about the bride price and the 200 foreskins, if all we have is 2 Samuel chapter 3, then David simply steals Michal from her husband, Palti, who, by the way, the text says, follows Michal weeping as he goes after her when Abner is taking her to David. The image that this conjures up for us of David is pretty messed up. But I would also say it's sort of consistent with David that we have in this story. This would be a marriage solely for the political gains that she affords him, which is how this worked a lot in the ancient world, and David makes good on this in some other scenarios in his life. I know that on its own, this thought experiment, it might not be too convincing, but when you start adding up all of these pieces of how the author of Samuel is presenting David, then you begin to wonder about David as a person. At the very least, he's complex, and so are the relationships that he has.
DJ Khaled! Hey! Yeah! All I do is win, 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 no matter what.